Okay, so good morning, everyone. So today I'll speak about a small part, a very small part of a much larger research that we did in Africa. And it could have been a much larger research unless COVID happened. So I'm not gonna, this is another different talk that I'm gonna talk, not today, about the challenges of doing research when COVID happens or anything similar to that. My partner to this research is Dr. Agnes Gispert-Kapinga. She's a Tanzanian, and we did the research in Tanzania. And what I'll talk about today is the rural-urban nexus of migration. And you can see the title, Rural Migrants in Urban Areas, Sources of Vulnerability or Agents of Adaptive Capacity. So the word vulnerability was mentioned in the previous talks, but I'll explain from my perspective as a geographer what vulnerability is, what adaptive capacity is, and what migration does to that on several different scales. But today I'll talk about the urban scale. So the outline, I'll start with a bit of background on climate migration research, talk about the case study. The study we did was conducted in Dar-es-salaam in Tanzania. It's a long story, COVID-related story, why we got to Dar-es-salaam for many reasons. And then a few words about the research method, the results, just the tip of the iceberg, and some conclusions to wrap up with. And I was preparing for a shorter talk, so I would have presented more results, but I'll just present just several main findings. So if we look at developments in climate migration research, I think we can see from the research that I know, at least in geography, kind of two main phases. There's phase one that talks about how climate drives migration, and you can see how the discourse is gradually shifting from climate migration to climate influence migration, meaning that it's becoming kind of a broader discourse that recognizes other migration drivers. In most cases, climate isn't the only driver of migration. And I think that if you look at the discourse, there's kind of a broad conclusion that, okay, climate can influence migration alongside other contextual factors. So if you look at the second phase is migration as adaptation. So what adaptation means? Adaptation is actually an action that you can take to reduce your vulnerability. Vulnerability is your propensity to be adversely affected. So basically, the factor that leads to negative impacts on individuals, households, other entities when a climate event happens, for example, flood, drought, etc. And adaptation is a strategy that people can use to reduce their vulnerability. How it works in migration, mainly through individuals or households migrating from rural areas, which are affected negatively by climate change, for example, mainly through their effect on livelihoods, to urban areas where they can generate climate insensitive income. That's kind of the main link that mediates between migration and adaptation. And it's also a very optimistic discourse because it introduces agency also into the discussion. People are not just kind of tools that are moved around by climate, but rather they can have a choice whether they want to migrate, whether migration is beneficial. It's not always beneficial, but at least in some cases, it is. So, several insights just to kind of summarize the discourse. Migration, first of all, is mainly internal, so mainly from rural areas to urban areas. We have much less information about the other type of migration, which is rural to rural, because it's much less documented. So we don't really know what are the estimates and how many people migrate from rural areas to other rural areas. But normally, international migration gets the headlines for the obvious reasons. But the overwhelming majority of migration is within countries because most people don't have the financial means to migrate abroad, and it's a much more complicated process, of course, as we all know. So migration will continue. It will likely increase due to climate change. So the climate signal in migration is going to probably increase as climate change becomes more prominent. And we know that under certain conditions, not always, migration can increase vulnerability. Sometimes it can reduce vulnerability, sometimes it increases vulnerability, but this is kind of where the discourse is now, how migration affects adaptive capacity and vulnerability. What we want to do is adopt a broader system perspective. Because if we look at the migration discourse that deals with vulnerability and adaptation, for the obvious reasons, because it's so economic, because it speaks about remittances, livelihood, etc., the focus is mainly on the basic economic functional unit, which is the household level. What we want to do is adopt a broader system perspective. And if we know that migration increases, we have to see what happens at the end of the line. So we need to look at the receiving areas or host areas or destination areas, any way you want to call them, and see what migration does to these areas that receive all these amounts of immigrants. And of course, if we talk about climate influenced migration, we're talking mainly about developing countries. So I don't know how many people of you have worked in agriculture. I'm originally from a kibbutz. I have worked in agriculture. Even when extreme events happen, droughts, floods didn't really happen every once in a while. It affected us, but we didn't migrate for various reasons, because we've got insurance, because we've got industry in the community, et cetera, et cetera. That is not the case in developing countries. So the focus is, of course, on developing countries, and these people migrate to cities that are already struggling to adapt to climate change and to extreme climate events and affect them in many ways. And I'll show, again, just a small part of that. So if we look at the discourse that looks at the effects on the receiving areas, it's just beginning. It's just beginning because, again, the emphasis has been on households until now. If we look at the discourse, it's not really empirical. It's mainly normative arguments that people make. I would say they kind of make them from a political standpoint, not really, or normative standpoint, but it's also very Western. So they talk about immigrants as sources of knowledge, as bringing new ways of thinking, etc. And we want to validate this discourse and actually kind of ground truth the discourse and look at it where migration really happens, which is not necessarily in the Western world. Therefore, the research question that we examined is, how do urban planners and policymakers perceive rural migrants in the areas that they arrive to as sources of vulnerability or agents of adaptive capacity? This is kind of broad frame that we chose for this study, and we focus on planners and policymakers. These are the people that deal with the migrants and environment and flooding, etc. So we're not trying to measure the exact effect and kind of quantify them of migration on the city, because it's a bit difficult to compare knowledge and, for example, the expansion of slum areas. It's not the same unit. It's very difficult to quantify. So we want to get the perspectives of the people who deal with migrants and plan for migration and for the environment. So the case study is Dar-es-salaam in Tanzania. It's the country's largest city. It's economic engine. So people migrate to Dar-es-salaam from all across the country. It's prone to flooding. This is just one of the floods that happened in Dar-es-salaam several years ago. So there are 2 rainy seasons, like in pretty much all of Eastern Africa, and floods happen every once in a while. And it's a major migration destination. These are just 2 pictures that Agnes took from the research area. So you can kind of get a feeling of where people live there, the migrants, mainly in the low-income areas, the flood-prone areas. So you can get just kind of a basic feeling of how these places look like in reality and where these migrants actually end up. So what we did is that we've interviewed 37, well, not me, it was COVID, I couldn't fly. Agnes could move in Tanzania, there were hardly any restrictions. So the research kind of just went on as usual. So we interviewed 37 planners and policymakers in Dar-es-salaam. We used a combination of open and closed questions. So normally we kind of ask them a question of, okay, how do you see the effect of migration on flooding? Positive, negative, or kind of similar effects in magnitude. And then we ask them to explain their answer. So we get sort of a quantitative estimate plus causality, causation through their explanations. And so we focus on 2 main dimensions, of course, how migration might increase vulnerability and how migration might reduce vulnerability. And we've analyzed the open questions. We just asked them in some cases, okay, tell us what the effects of migration on the city. So we use thematic analysis. For those of you who are not familiar with it, just finding kind of the meanings within text. So let's move to the results. I'll show only, again, a very, very small part of the results. We've asked these policymakers and planners, what is the effect of migration on flooding in Dar-es-salaam? Most of them, slightly over a half, see the effect as negative, which is already very different from what most of the literature says, that we only need to, accept and embrace the immigrants and everything is going to be great. They see things slightly differently, and you can see that some of them see a positive effect, some see positive effects and negative effects of a similar magnitude, and some actually said that migration does not affect flooding. But they didn't really mean, when we asked them to explain their answers, what they meant is there are more structural factors that affect flooding. So bad planning, bad infrastructure. It's not that migration doesn't affect flooding, but it's contingent on other factors. So as for the negative example, just to kind of show you what they meant, they've mentioned unregulated construction and waste disposal. This is a picture, again, on the left that Agnes took in one of the neighborhoods. You can see how it looks like. People live in slum areas, which are unplanned areas. They're areas that the city doesn't necessarily recognize. So there's no infrastructure. So people dump their waste wherever they can. They build wherever they can. And this is the outcome. Another factor that they've mentioned is that people come from rural areas, convert floodplains into urban agriculture. The interesting point here was because we carried the research out during COVID, and they said it's bad, but it contributes to urban food security, which was interesting. But again, it exacerbates flooding because these people don't necessarily integrate within kind of the normal urban labor market. Some of them go to the city, but they continue to be farmers within the city. So instead of using this area as basically a sponge that absorbs water, they convert it to agriculture, which hardly has any positive effect for reducing runoff. Some of them do some other jobs. It's difficult to see here, I know, but some of them mine sand from the river channels, which means that it completely alters the flow of water. So it's difficult to see, but here there's like a small amount of sand, and here these are areas that the sand has been removed from. So they completely alter the natural infrastructure of the flow of water. So then we've asked them, okay, migration is mainly negative. You've mentioned that. So if we speak about positive effects, we need to some extent to speak in terms of potential, not necessarily more tangible positive effects. So here we ask them, okay, if migration exacerbates flooding, what resources and capabilities migrants possess that the city can harness to reduce flooding? And it's difficult to read, but all of these yellow columns, they speak about capabilities that migrants can help themselves within the migrant communities. So for example, information sharing about flooding. They've mentioned mobility as a coping mechanism. By the way, one of the most interesting things we found is a topic that is completely understudied, I think, at least in the climate science of it, is internal migration within cities. So the city established a place that people can go to and actually be relocated to this place. And what they do is that they migrate within the city seasonally. So when it floods, they go to that place because it's safe, but then they miss out on the economic opportunities that they return to after flooding stops. So the kind of a cyclical migration within the city, whereas before that we spoke about cyclical migration only rural, urban, etc. So it's a different kind of migration that happens on an internal urban scale. And all these blue bars talk about all the resources and capabilities that planners and policymakers thought they can use to reduce the vulnerability of the city. So we can see adaptation knowledge, which is kind of in line with what the literature says. I'll show examples in a second of what they meant of adaptation knowledge. I don't know whether this can be upscaled to the city level, but this is something that they've managed. Some of them see the immigrants simply as physical labor. So you could also understand the different perspectives that they have on these migrants, how they see them. They see them as physical economic assets, or they see them as sources of knowledge, as people that they should communicate with. These are very different perspectives. So they've mentioned they can be used for labor, for maintaining water channels. Some of they said that the more educated ones, maybe they have technical and planning skills that the city can harness. And some of them, again, looked at them as a kind of a productive asset in the more traditional sense, and say that they contribute to the city's economy, they enlarge the city's tax base so they can fund more infrastructure to prevent flooding. But the migrants are viewed, again, very differently here, not really as sources of knowledge. So these are just two examples of migrants' adaptation knowledge, how they apply to reduce flooding. So you can see tires on the left picture. So they put these tires and they tie them to make them stay in the same place. And whenever there's a flood, it's supposed to reduce the power of water, the erosive power of water, to reduce the negative effects of flooding. Whether this is something that can be upscaled to a city level, I doubt very much. But this is just an example that we had a picture of that Agnes took. Another thing that they do is that they elevate the walls of houses to prevent flooding from coming into the house. Again, to what extent this can be used, I don't know. And then we've asked them, okay, you've mentioned that there are certain resources and capabilities that you can use. So who's supposed to do that? And here we had quite an array of answers. It could give, as you can see, more than one answer. So many of them thought it's the central government. It's not the city that's supposed to deal with that. And others mentioned it's every member of society is supposed to do something to reduce the effect of flooding. The interesting thing here is that if we look at the literature that deals with the urban dimensions of climate change, the city level is always highlighted as the most important level because it mediates between individuals and the higher levels of government. So only several of them, well, a third of the respondents answered that it's the local government, it's the city that should take action. Most of them don't really see the city as a very relevant player in this migration game. So just several conclusions to end with. We've seen that differently from the main discourse that we can see in the literature, migrants are perceived mainly as sources of vulnerability, at least partly because their actions are visible. The effects and negative effects of migration are visible: expansion of slum areas, conversion of floodplains to agriculture, etc. So there's a high visibility of these negative effects. At the same time, these policymakers answer that migration can improve adaptive capacity. They said that migrants do possess some resources and capabilities that can be reduced, that can be harnessed to reduce flooding. But these resources and capabilities, many of them are latent. Knowledge is latent. You need to do something to use this knowledge. Whether the city can use it or not, again, that's a whole different question. But many of the resources and capabilities that I mentioned need an action at the city level to be exploited. But as we saw, the city doesn't really see itself as a relevant player. So it's kind of migration happens, people arrive into urban areas, but the city basically complains to the central government, help us with it. It's not really our responsibility. And that's a big problem. We also asked them, how do you see these migrants actually, if you know that climate change is leading to their migration? Some of them said, it doesn't really matter because people come anyway, we need to deal with them. It doesn't, whether it's climate change or anything else, it's of no importance. Some others said it's important because then we can point at the broader international community, international organizations, etc., and demand assistance. So here even we had some different perspectives on that. So I'll end with the last conclusion. It's quite normative. I know it's a bit fluffy, but I don't see a way around it. To actually help cities deal with climate change, maybe they should need to start talking with the migrants who actually get there and see what they can do to reduce their negative effects and to use the positive effects to the benefit of the city. That's it.
Thank you very much.